Hi y'all, it's Michelle Johnson with Have Color Will Travel, and today I'm going to be doing some mixed media experiments on top of crayon and petroleum jelly backgrounds. I started with rollerball pens just to see, could I write on it? Yes, but it never actually dried. The next thing I did was I went with some permanent markers, as loads of folks love to color with them. And I found what happened really interesting. It dried fairly quickly, but when it did, it created this really interesting texture that you can see here on the close-up. I think that'd be super fun to color with or to do mixed media projects with. Glitter pens and jelly rollers, they did smear a little bit, but not a whole lot. The next step was oil pastels because I love to play with them. I was really expecting there to be some sort of extra smoothness about having oil pastel on top of petroleum jelly and crayon, since petroleum jelly is an oil-based product and crayons are wax-based. But I honestly found that there wasn't a whole lot of difference in the way that the oil pastel behaved on top of this background as it did on regular paper. And in fact, right here, you'll see I had to test it out. I'm like, is it actually doing exactly what I expected to do on regular paper? And turns out, yeah, it smears with just the same amount of effort. And so there wasn't really much of a difference there, which was a surprise to me. Colored pencils pretty much behaved as they normally did on top of a petroleum jelly and crayon background, as did Neocolor 1 wax pastels. No change, still interesting, but not out of the ordinary. Then came the Stabilo 3-in-1 colored pencil. I did something simple here, just dipped the tip in water and then colored onto the background. From there, I just took my finger and had a good old time smearing it across the paper. I'm going to zoom in and see if it, look at that texture. It's almost as if I added salt onto the paper. It's really interesting what happened, and it's become completely dry. It dried fairly quickly. I can't do anything to move it, so that's really fun. I wanted to show you the difference, though, that this is me having painted some of the Stabilo. I took my wet watercolor brush and I just used the tip of the pencil as if it was a pan of watercolor and just painted. And you'll see here how the edges are nice and solid. It's not doing anything truly out of the ordinary right here. I did the same thing here, but let me zoom in one more time. Notice that really interesting feathering texture all the way around. And I mean, that was a lot of pigment. I may have had less pigment on my brush here. I'm not entirely certain. So that's super interesting how the oil of the crayon and of the petroleum jelly works with the Stabilo all. Here I was just brushing and seeing what would happen. And again, it just makes some interesting effects. It's very much like putting salt onto your paper when you do watercolor and then watching the crystals create these interesting and organic shapes. So for my experimentation, this particular thing, the petroleum jelly background with the Stabilo all over the top and water, that's just really cool to me. Up next was watercolor pencils. So after having the raging success with the Stabilo Woody over here, over this petroleum jelly and crayon background, I thought I'd try just my Prismacolor watercolor pencil and see if it worked the same. I don't think it did. Like, this is where I brushed on some water after I had used my tip of the pencil, like I did down here, and it's still really pooled, and I really have no answer for why. Stabilo Woodies are a water-soluble pencil, but they are also a crayon, so maybe there's something in the mixture, because this is a much drier kind of watercolor pencil. As you can see here, looking at the difference between the two, it's not just that the Stabilo Woody has a fatter tip. I can't make that move a whole lot, whereas on the Stabilos, same pressure gets a lot of dispersion of the pigment. I also did notice, though, like here I colored onto the paper and then added water, and it does stain just like it did here, and it doesn't integrate onto the paper, which, you know, so there's a similarity, but it didn't do quite as much staining. And this is just brushing it on. This is, I colored down with a wet pencil and then ran my my finger over it, like this particular test over here, and it's not nearly as interesting to me. I'll let you zoom in. It's got the stain of where I initially colored, and that just looks like a smear versus what we have here, which is this lovely texture that has the background showing through as well. Like, I'm curious, what would that look like if I had done it over here on a completely different colored background, or say if I did it with a yellow crayon, what would that, how would that look? Because these colors that I did it on top of are really similar to they're in the same family as this one, and that blue had already kind of covered up. So yeah, that's interesting. I really expected, okay, so this is starting to dry. This was brushed with color, so it's starting to dry. Is it smear? Not really. Oh, finally the gel, the sparkly gel is, well, it's mostly dried. That one took a long time to dry. Yeah, so golly, and that's still wet. I'm not as impressed, or I'm not as tempted. It's not like a comparison of quality or not. It's not, the Stabilo Woody creates a much more interesting coloring and art experience when you mix those media together than a standard watercolor pencil, which the Prismacolor Premier watercolor pencils are. So I just thought that was an interesting thing to discover. Well, thanks for joining me, y'all, on these adventures. By far, the Stabilo was my favorite. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you again soon.